Hello, Susan Corbett, custom machine quilter, here with a beauty. Feast your eyes on this masterpiece. My client said this is her favorite quilt. It's for show and display. She enlarged the applique pattern and piled on the embroidery. So there's a load of things for us to see here. Look at all these details. And it was a wonderful chance to decide what to quilt and what not to quilt, how much outlining, how much is too little, how much is too much. It's a real treat. I have this gorgeous applique and embroidered quilt all stabilized, except for this last section of border. So that's what we'll be looking at here at this moment. I'm still getting used to this new long arm. It's pretty uncomfortable, but I'm getting there inch by inch. So this may look pretty darn awkward. I don't know. It sure feels awkward. We'll see how it goes. This is the first time I've worked, not today, but with this machine. One of the things I'm getting used to is having a stitch regulator. I rarely needed one before. And I left it on at the very beginning because I didn't need one more thing to think about. That was just one less concern while I learned the ins and outs of the machine. And then I tried to turn it off and go without, and now that feels just as awkward. So sometimes I can start outlining the applique and it's just no big deal. It goes like I had a quilt on the other day that was just no problem. And then every once in a while, it's like I'm a rank beginner, which has been my experience throughout learning this new machine. I feel like I have to learn everything all over again. So when it feels really awkward, I rely on rulers to help out. And then when they start to feel like more of a hindrance than a help, that's when I'll just go back to freehanding it. And no matter what's going on, I rely on them most for these long stretches, these broad lines that need to be smooth, because those are always the hardest thing there is to quilt for me. Usually the more horizontal a line is, the less I need a ruler. And these short little trips here and there, I can get by without. Oh, I just want this to feel normal at some point. It's been 2 months. I had all kinds of trouble. Had the handles replaced because that kept acting up. It was doing all sorts of stuff I'd never seen before. Now all the little insects and the stuff that are floating around in the border that are not attached to this vine, those will get stabilized later on when I do the background quilting. But I don't want to take the time at the moment to fool with all those stops and starts. I find that there's no magic ruler that'll do just what I want it to do. I'm always changing those things around. I haven't recorded anything since end of September, early October, something like that. So even that feels foreign. I'm loving all the great detail that the embroidery adds to the applique. This client is pretty good at that stuff. The fabric is all cotton, it's not wool. I've quilted about 8 blocks, so the backgrounds so far. Here's a little smattering of those. I'm still out of a normal routine, so it didn't occur to me to tape any of this stuff. Sorry. So I'll be explaining more of these later, but as you can see, I've been having some fun. I'm especially fond of this one. I'm especially fond of my clients' embroidery and applique. Wow. Had to throw in some feathers here. I like that. All right, so the one I'm doing right now is this one. What I see here, let's stand way back and look at it. I perceived two things. One, I see a circle, and then I see radiating lines. So I'm going to try to use both of those. So what I've done so far is I started with this guy, and I placed it where, see the lines on that ruler? So I've got one going down here and the other lines across there, and got it centered as much as possible, which gave me this outer line. And then I pulled this one, which isn't exactly the right size, but it'll still work. So I'll put that here. I'm just eyeballing the distance between those two lines, so it makes a double line. And then I have opted for just a random background, swirls and circles with echo all over the place. So let's see how that is gonna play out. Here's how I'm doing it, one little pie wedge at a time. I don't know if these are going to match up exactly, but I think in the end it's going to look like they do. And that's good enough. That will actually work. So as long as I'm there, yes, I did. I just quilted right over that embroidered stem. I don't think it's going to show with thread this skinny. I either would have had to stop and start all over again or do a lot of backtracking. I'm not going for symmetry here. This is background quilting. I don't think you're really going to notice that type of thing. It's going to look like fill, not like a bunch of individual objects. Well, that's off. Not too terribly bad. So the circle gets made and filled in, and now we'll move on to the radiating lines. And where did those come from? Well, see how those 4 green stems kind of form spokes. So that's where that idea. And the circle, the implication there was those little leaves on the spokes. So that's just my design process. So I'm keeping the ruler at the center point at all times. So it's getting wider at both intervals, but at different angles. So this stays the same. And this gets a little bit wider. And this is when you want a nice long ruler. It's not too far from the center of this block to the outer edge, but on other quilts, those can be really far apart. So that nice long ruler comes in really, really handy. We're almost there. am I going to get the spacing right at the end? Well, a lot of times I just luck out and it works out. We'll see what happens this time. And it did. Okay. What do we think about that? I think it's gorgeous. It would have been 50 times harder to just do radiating lines. So it's a good idea that, to put something else in there. It makes it a lot more interesting and dynamic. And I think that was time well spent. So for this guy, what I'm seeing is these embroideries close off this area almost entirely. I can fill in with something here and here, and then move into the background quilting there. And in these empty spaces, I think I'm gonna quilt a flower. So that sews that up. Each one is a little bit different, but this space here is a lot wider than the rest of them. So I don't exactly know how that's gonna go. Well, I can fill in with leaves. I like to echo the flowers, provide a little bit of separation from the background quilting. This wouldn't matter as much if they were large, but they're kind of little. The background quilting here is a tiny little teardrop with echo. And to maneuver around, the little irregular shapes that are left over, some little arcs will help fill in, and it won't look very different than the echo does. So that's very adaptable. Okay, I don't know what I'm going to do around the perimeter. I want it to be something else, something different. But we'll leave that here for a little while later. Right now, I'm going to travel over here. What I really know is that for this part, see how sweet and delicate the little embroidery is. So I want the quilting to be in that same vein. Something kind of cute and lacy. A bunch of little tiny swirls would look good. I've speeded up this part, so it sounds kind of weird. There isn't a problem with the machine or anything. It's just that I've hurried this thing along in the interest of time. There was room here to quilt in between that leaf and the stem, so I took that shortcut. And I've added this little feathery flourish in here because there was so much room. I don't like to leave big spaces full of just little tiny background quilting. When there's room to put something, I think it's more interesting if there's more motif in there than just background. There's ample space here too, so I'm throwing in a partial flower. It looks like the rest of it is behind that stem. So you could throw in whatever you wanted to here. Some leaves, some little, some flourishes, just whatever you can think of that might look good in a given space. And here, this space is not as ample, so here just background quilting. Maybe you saw that coming. But when I was doing the background quilting, I distinctly heard leaves. So that's what I'm going with. Leaves, and I'm not sure what else. Well, so that's really beautiful. It's flowers, leaves, a few flourishes, some background quilting, and some echo, which is pretty much what's happening in the outer border. That's cohesive and really pretty. It looks more complicated than it really is. I have freehanded 3/4 of the border. I've had round after round of I don't know what I'm doing. This is awkward. I don't like it. So, you know, those voices are a thing. Sometimes you just have to battle through. Here I'm mimicking the leaf right here. As long as I'm here, I'm gonna quilt this little stretch of background. I'm doing a baby loop meander. I think it's more fun and more forgiving than a regular little tiny meander. It looks lacy and cute. Okay, and then going back to Echo. I thought I would strive for some symmetry to keep all the background the same. And of course that plan flew out the window immediately because all the applique is a little bit different on each one. They're very similar, but they're different. So plan A wasn't going to work anyway. I took pictures of what I had done before to try and replicate stuff, and that just went nowhere. And I thought, well, I'll just aim to get as close as I can. And it's not going that way. So they're all going to be really different, which is what I like to do anyway. I think that is so funny. This is why I don't like to make a lot of plans, because something comes along and disrupts it. There's what you plan, and then there's what really happens. I didn't outline these little guys when I stabilized the quilt. So picking those back up again as I go along. Inside these spaces here, so here and here, I'm trying to do something a little bit different because I want some contrast. So that's how these lines came to be in here. What all the space in the border have in common are various leaves, curls, swirls, a loop meander, echo quilting, and a few things like feathers here and there. So even though it's all different, they all have those same common elements in them. So around this flower, you see these little indentations here that the petals make. I got a great big urge to swirl around there, and I'm kind of swirl happy. Swirl and leaf happy for sure. And I was trying to keep all the leaves nice and symmetrical and going in all the, the proper, I don't know, what's the word I'm hunting for? I guess to keep the leaves in the same direction consistently, and that's not working either. Thrown out the rule book there. On the other side of this vessel, I'm starting out with the little loop meander to get that out of the way, and then moving right into the corresponding leaf. Which is easy to do. The first time I heard do the veining first and then build the leaf around it, I was incredulous. But then I tried it, and now I love that way of working. It's great. So you can make a leaf either way, with the outline or with the veins. And then echo. Outlining that little insect. And now I'm going to fill in around all that embroidery at the top of that border. Sorry it's not all in frame. This is tricky. So I'm just moving all over the place with mostly the loop meander. But then when you get out in space and there is space to quilt, then you can do all kinds of other little flourishes, leaves and berries and whatnot. An echo, especially around the very top edge, so that it's easier on your fingers when you're binding it. Filling this space went pretty fast. Since I've gotten this computerized long arm, I've been online watching what people do with it, and I'm amazed at the things people will spend so long programming their machine to do for them, that I'm thinking, wow, freehanding it would be so much easier. And even though this part is it is painstaking, but it's way faster, I think, just to haul off and quilt it, right? But a lot of people don't know how to freehand. And I've been saying for years, just put in the work. Just put a quilt on and try and try and try and try and try. And I hear, Susan, just because you can do this doesn't mean anybody else can. And I just still have a hard time believing that. One of my mentors said years ago, some wonderful information I'll pass along. She said she liked to tell her grandkids, don't tell me you can't do it unless you've tried it like 10 times. And she said to their delight, they would find that they could do it. Maybe less than 10 times. So, I just think it's well worth learning. Sure, some people will take to it faster than others, but I like the concept of pick one shape and do it and do it and do it until you have some mastery over it, and then add to your little library of things you know how to do. It gets easier as time goes by. When I first learned how to make feathers, I just thought they were pretty bad, but I took a feather class and learned about all the different things you can do with them, and it was just so much more exciting than it was daunting. It was great. So that emboldened me to keep going. One time, a client brought me a quilt that she wanted me to quilt for her that was not yet finished. She was pretty proud of it, and rightly so. And she asked me, what do you think, what other thing could I do to this top that would make it better? And I told her, embroider your applique. Put some little extra finishing touch on it and use a contrasting thread. And that quilt won blue ribbons everywhere it went. The payoff in doing that kind of thing is huge. And I can see where at the end of all the applique you'd think, well, I don't want to do one more thing to it. I'm done. This client said, because I asked her about that, and she said, no, that's when I got excited, because I knew how much the applique could add. How much the embroidery could add. And so gorgeous. This is all handwork, by the way. It's not machine embroidery at all. So cotton fabric, hand embroidery, all kinds of different threads, and a lot of skill. And I asked her one time, how could I learn how to do this? And she said, get a book and learn the stitches and do it. So that's very inspiring. The payoff for all that work is just enormous here. I'm going to make him look like he's sitting on a flower. And then echo it. I'm always looking at quilting pictures online, and I see that it's common practice among some quilters when they're doing background quilting just to throw in everything they've ever learned willy-nilly. Like they'll be going along doing one background and then they'll throw in some other kind of background, and the changes look arbitrary. And I wonder what made you stop and change this over here. I like for the differences to look integrated and cohesive. So even though I'm using several different designs, I want them to have some kind of a rationale so it makes sense. So some tools like echo and little arcs and things like that can make it look like it's cohesive and planned, even though it really kind of isn't. So I think I'm doing pretty well here. See, in the space between the flower with the ladybug and the leaf and stem, there wasn't room to do much more of anything else. So the little dense background quilting makes sense. It's so small that it makes the flower stand out more. So what you're going to notice is the flower and not the dense background quilting. And then when we get out where there's room, then you can put in some more recognizable motifs and use echo to tie it all up together. When I was doing the opposite border, these scallops started happening, and that made me think of this. They're little scallops. They look darling. They certainly are fitting with the mood of this quilt. So I echoed them once, like I did the scallopy leaves. Echo again. And now do some more scallops that are offset. And then echo those pretty closely. So here's where you want to think about tying off and starting a new line of quilting over to the right, because that's already a whole lot of backtracking. Here is a transition. I don't want to do any more of those little clamshells, so I don't know how to explain to you how you get from one point to another. That just looked like a good place to tuck in a swirl or a curl or whatever, and then do some more echo in a way that kind of radiates a little bit. So where oh look, some symmetry. Huh. So where I'm stopping and hesitating, I'm thinking, okay, now what do I do? It's an organic process. I think it comes by having done it so many times. You just kind of have some kind of a memory of what worked and what didn't work, and And so from this point on, we're back to the swirls and the lines of echo. So there is some consistency here. Here's another bee with some space around him, so let's put in another flower. This one's kind of a different flower. So I'm not going to go back in here and add any little creases or anything, because the petals are smaller and I don't want to put in a lot of clutter around the bee. But he's pretty darling now, and that flower took up a whole bunch of space. There's more space in these backgrounds than you would think in the beginning. Moving on to the sashing. Well, I figured out what I wanted to do. I auditioned any number of ideas here, and this one seemed to be the one that felt right. Again, I don't know how to explain that to you. This is a show quilt, so I didn't just want to freehand those orange peels. So I'm going to use a ruler. All kinds of rulers came with the new machine, and I'm having fun playing with those. So I've done the math, figured out how wide I wanted those increments to be, and I'm not a marker on a quilt like this. I could have used chalk, but on that light blue, I don't know that it would show up that much. So one of my tricks is to use pins. These flathead pins are pretty good for this purpose because they're not super thick like the corsage pins I used to pin the quilt onto the canvases. They're kind of skinny, they're flexible. You can see how bent they are. So I put them where they need to go and then start making arcs. And you can see I'm just kind of approximating here. The increment is sort of the same, but it's not perfect all the way through because I don't know how to do perfect. I suppose when I learn how to computerize a narrow border like this, that could probably be a lot more accurate. But I'm not there yet. And you see, I'm not making exactly a half circle. It's going to look like I did, but I haven't, because I don't have a ruler that was the perfect size. So now going in the other direction. And once you get going, this doesn't take all day. This is actually pretty quick. It's not anywhere near as quick as freehanding it would be, but again, this is not just any quilt. And see how it isn't a circle? It kind of makes a point. And so that's where I know, that's like the middle. That's where I'm aiming for the middle there with that ruler. The eye doesn't really see what is there. It sees what it thinks it sees. So this is going to appear like round circles. Maybe to somebody who knows what's really going on, they'll be able to see through that illusion, but most people will not. I get asked all the time, how do you get this to be so perfect? I don't. Never have, probably never will. And then the background of that is a pattern meander. It's not supposed to be round. It's supposed to be pretty vertical with rounded edges and little. I'm using a really skinny thread here. So I don't normally like to have this much dense quilting up against another area of dense quilting, but this one seemed to work out. I don't know, I just went with my gut instinct, which I can recommend, but it's not a really explainable thing. I guess the difference in fabric helps. The difference in color. Really cute. Let's move on to talking about the quilting on the applique itself. It's a mistake to leave the applique unquilted. It doesn't need a lot of quilting, but it does need a little something. So here I've outlined the parts of that center flower. This is going to involve a whole bunch of thread changes. Here, this is with red thread. There was also green and yellow. And here I'm outlining those little spokes. You can see for yourself, see where the ones that are unquilted, how they look deflated. They kind of ripple in a sad little way. So outlining that embroidery makes them look full and finished, tailored. And it kind of makes those little blue points on the end puff up attractively. So that's an important detail. Look how the red applique in the middle of that flower puffs right up. That's looking really good. So I'm outlining the little rows of embroidery on this detail. Just the insides, not the outsides. I did kind of the reverse in another part of the quilt that was very similar, but this just felt right. I think to quilt all of it down, I mean, you certainly could have, but that would have really squashed it up. So in this part, see, I've got the needle right up against those little scallopy things. And I can quilt just a broad line or go in and around all the little scallops for more definition. This is so worth it. Makes it look really good. So I've outlined around that yellow piece of fabric with the red thread. But later on, when I switched, I put some yellow thread in and I ditch quilted between that leaf and the yellow part of that flower. I think it made it look a lot more finished and more beautiful. So by the time you've gotten to this point in the quilt, the overwhelming urge is to move on. Let's wrap it up. But adding these little details is really, really important. On these flowers, see how there's space in between the little loops the embroidery makes? It really is worth it to slow way down and quilt right in between each of those little loops. It just makes the embroidery stand up and look gorgeous. And that's how I outline quilted the little flowers on the perimeter of that flower. And then here on the bottom of this row of embroidery, it's not anywhere near as divided. So there I'm just freehanding a line. You can see how I've outlined the embroidery on the green part along those spokes that it makes, but I've not quilted on the veins of the little leaves here. And over on the left, you can see where I've outlined the embroidery on that great big leaf in the middle of this block. I love how she embroidered those crisscrosses over the stem of the whole thing. Really effective. Gorgeous, gorgeous stuff. All this flower needs is just outlining of that center part. I think any more outlining around the little tiny flower parts is just going to squash it a whole lot. And the same thing goes for this little flower. Just arcing around those little scallops. I quilted around the green, or, in the middle of the whole block, that yellow flower on the green background. Just outlined that. And here, let's play this game. What do you think these parts need? I ditch quilted between the green and the red, outlined that yellow flower. So, do you think it needs more? Or is it okay the way it is? I was going to leave it like that. and it just doesn't look right. So I'm adding some more quilting around all the little leafy parts. It would have been good to know that ahead of time, so I wouldn't have had as many stops and starts, but whatever. I think it looks 50 billion times better with all of those little parts outlined. And so to get from one side to the other, I'm just re-outlining that one part of the flower. It's fine. Now it doesn't look deflated anymore. Here's a better look. I would not do this outlining with the open toe foot. I think that could cause undue damage to the embroidery. This flower is kind of big, and I had an instinct about this one immediately. Of course, you want to outline the the yellow center, and then I did want to put something out here on these, but I didn't want to quilt in and around all the little spiky elements at the very end, because I didn't want to squash it very much. So I'm quilting right up against the edge of that green part. I totally think that was the right thing to do, because now the little blue dots at the end, they're free. They puff up nicely. That is gorgeous. I especially like that little braid around the very edge of the whole thing. That is so beautiful. I debated whether to outline these. I thought they were a little bit small, but I'm really glad I did it in the end. Really glad. See the difference between one that's outlined and the one on the left that's not? This one also, I ditch quilted around that blue strip, but couldn't quilt around the little spindly embroidery either. So that's nice and puffy. I'm not sure what the right thing to do is there. I do think it needs to be tacked down somehow. I think a little bit of hand quilting right around the stem would be a really good idea. I think by machine it'll just be really heavy-handed. So I didn't quilt there. Here I outlined a whole bunch of stuff in the vessel. I debated whether to do anything around here. It was really standing straight up, or I wouldn't have done any. But when it came to the accompanying leaf, I just couldn't do any quilting in there. It just felt wrong. So in the end, I think what that leaf needs is some hand quilting. I thought about doing it myself. I don't know. I think I pretty much know what to do and what not to do around embroidery, but sometimes I don't know. See, I wouldn't have done anything on these little bitty leaves. I think they're too little. I like the way they look all nice and puffy. I mean, why do all this kind of applique if you're just going to squash it? So, judgment call. In this block, I was noticing how these corners were making it look kind of square. So that's what gave me the idea to put some lines around it, like, you know, it has its own little border built in. So right in the corner, the lines kind of do a plaid. And I figured out the spaces, the width, I guess, just based on how much space there was there, which wasn't a whole lot. I had planned to do a lot more, but you know, there's what you plan and then there's what really happens. So, and then I thought, you know, this doesn't need much more. There's a lot happening in this block. So I filled in with this little meander, little rainbows, which I think are very effective here. I like the way that looks. And in this block, since there were so many leaves happening there, I just went crazy with leaves. You know, big ones with veins out where there's room, and then little ones with just a little suggestion of a vein where they're smaller. Pretty good. For this block, nothing was coming to me. And then I thought, well, let's just kind of give it a little border of leaves. And then I filled in with some swirls and circles and some echo. So that took care of that. I like it. Here there was some room to spread out and do something, so I put in some feathers. And then did some S echoes in the rest of it. I think that's pretty good. This block is so directional. So I had a couple of clues as to what I thought I should do here. I gave it some ground, just some ground meandering there. I dropped in some flowers that look like the applique, kind of. With the circular motion down here and up there, I just closed the circle there at the top to give me some separation, and then two different background quilting options. So in here, in the interior, the applique, the embroidery is so spindly that scale becomes a factor. So I opted for this background that I learned years and years and years ago. It's called scribble. You just do lines all over the place, just in every direction. When I offer clients this option, they think it's ugly and they don't want it in there, but look how effective it is here. It kind of mimics the spiky look of that embroidery. It can be small. It doesn't really look like anything. It's just a bunch of scribble. So it's not trying to be anything. It's just background. And it's really good contrast with all of the circles, the echo, the flowers. I think that's great. Okay, so on the embroidery itself, I quilted right around on each side, here and then under here, and then around this guy. And I just did a little bit around here, but not in here, because I didn't want to squash it too much. So I think that's pretty darn good. Okay, in this block, there's already a lot of movement in there. It kind of spins around. So I put in some pairs of lines to continue the spinning motion, and then put all kinds of little things in between the empty spaces. And once again, I'm going for as good a contrast as I can possibly get. So they're all pretty different. I don't think I repeated anything. But that was a lot of fun. That was quite the field day. And I'm noticing how I like the linear aspects of this. This, I think, is pretty effective. It gives you pattern without a lot of busy stuff. And I am loving the straight lines in this section. This is a chance for this part to be kind of quiet, as opposed to the high energy movement in this part. I got a little bit mixed up as to where these lines were supposed to go, so I added some little dimensional quilting in here to have some separation, have something a little bit different. This is a fun, I don't know what to call it. It's just, I like that. See how it's the same kind of thing happening here, but a different shape. More straight lines, but in a different way. It's a pattern meander. I like it. These are elongated pebbles. I don't think every pebble needs to be round, so I love that. Some swirls, some feathers, a simple figure 8. That was a weird shape for that to go into, so it started out as a little baby loop meander and then blossomed into a figure 8. All right, in this block, see, I was noticing that it wanted to be circular, and I thought it was kind of fun to have those circles overlapping. I like that crisscross in the middle. I like the little circles with echo in the background. Here, all I quilted was in the ditch right here. There's no quilting inside this part. And I outlined this part in here. That, I think, looks better in person than it does here in this shot. All that quilting, just simple as it is, adds a lot of dimension. So loving that part. I thought some ruler work would look really good in here. So I've kind of outlined the whole thing. And the funny thing about a ruler, I don't care how many you have, it's tricky to get them to nest properly. I want these lines to be parallel, but at this angle, they just weren't going to be. So I tried to do something that's really pleasing. It's the same shape, but they're not exactly parallel. And I think that's just fine. So I used a couple different rulers to get that done, and then picked two background quilting designs. I love this. This is what I want to do when I want something lacy and intricate, but I don't want it to fill up the whole thing. See, because I didn't want to quilt in here, and I can't really tell you why I didn't want to do that. I just thought that would be a bit much. It might be kind of nice to leave it kind of blank. So this little filigree stuff in here, you start to make a circle and then you stop and then backtrack a little bit and then go to the next one, changing directions all the time. I love the way that looks. And this is a variation. It's a circle with some echo. And there's a million ways to do that, depending on where you stop and start and, you know, all kinds of things. So that's one of my favorite blocks in here. Okay, this one had some fun here. I liked all the different directions the flowers are kind of pointing to, so I just quilted some lines emanating out. And then in the spaces that are left over, I added some leaves. I did some echoing. Probably my favorite part of the whole thing are these little zigzags. I love the way that looks. I think that's really effective. A straight line design that's not difficult, it's really freehand and imparts a whole different texture. I didn't know what I was going to do down here. You know, those two sides it just kind of took over. Echo a little bit and then see what wants to happen. Here is the finished quilt. Overall, I'm liking it a lot. I think the quilting is subtle. I'm sure plenty of people would think it's way too much. What I want to do is enhance all the beautiful work here, not overwhelm it. I don't know. I think I've succeeded. We'll have to see what the client thinks. I did several thread changes on this quilt. I used cream, a gray in the sashing. It's kind of a blue gray, but it looks like gray to me. I used this gingery color here in the cornerstones and in a couple of other places. It didn't show up a lot. And I switched to a yellow just for a few little places like this one, a green, because there was a lot of little green details to go after. So here's a look at the back. It's a really beautiful print that hides all the thread colors. So that worked out really nicely. This quilt certainly inspired me. I hope it inspires you. Thanks.